Some men survive war, only to lose to hunger. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if you believe no veteran should ever have to trade his honor for a meal, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Because what happened inside a small grocery store in northern Montana would remind an entire town what loyalty really looks like. The wind rattled the thin aluminum walls of the trailer like old bones shivering in winter. Outside, dawn crawled slowly across the frozen outskirts of Kalispell, Montana, painting the snowbanks in pale blue light. The air smelled of pine sap, diesel fumes, and wood smoke drifting from distant cabins tucked deep among the evergreens. Inside the trailer, Walter Hayes sat alone at a tiny kitchen table scarred with cigarette burns and water rings older than most people still alive. The old man's hands trembled slightly as he opened a faded velvet box beneath the weak yellow glow of a flickering overhead bulb. His fingers were thin now, veins like blue roots twisted beneath weathered skin. The kind of hands that had once carried rifles through jungles and dragged wounded men through mud. Now they struggled just to hold a spoon steady. Inside the box rested a single medal. Purple heart, tarnished silver edges. A ribbon faded with time. Walter stared at it for a long moment without blinking. The silence around him felt enormous. Heavy, like the world had already moved on and forgotten to tell him. Snow tapped softly against the trailer windows. Somewhere beyond the trees, a train horn moaned low through the valley. Walter swallowed hard. "Sorry, Tommy," he whispered quietly. His voice sounded dry and cracked from years of disuse. The name lingered in the cold air like smoke from an extinguished fire. Tommy Reed, 21 years old forever. Smiling face. Alabama accent. Dead since 1971. Walter rubbed his thumb slowly across the metal's scratched surface before closing his eyes. The memory still came sharp sometimes. Too sharp. Humid jungle heat. Helicopter blades cutting through rain. The smell of wet earth and gun oil. Young men laughing because they were too scared not to. Then silence. Endless silence. Afterward, Walter opened his eyes again and looked toward the refrigerator across the trailer. He already knew what waited inside. Half a carton of milk. One slice of ham folded inside wax paper. Nothing else. The refrigerator hummed weakly like it was tired too. On the counter beside the sink sat a stack of unpaid utility bills held down beneath an ashtray filled with old peppermint wrappers instead of cigarettes. Walter had quit smoking 20 years earlier after his wife Mary got sick. Mary, even thinking her name still hurt in strange quiet places inside him. Her framed photograph stood near the microwave, dusty now. She was smiling in the picture, auburn hair blowing in the wind beside Flathead Lake. Walter reached over and gently straightened the frame with trembling fingers. "Wish you were here, sweetheart," he murmured. The television in the corner suddenly crackled to life from its weak antenna signal. A cheerful morning anchor appeared beneath bright studio lights. "Today we honor America's heroes," the woman announced warmly. "Veterans across the country continue inspiring the next generation through courage and sacrifice." Walter let out the faintest breath through his nose. Not quite a laugh. Not quite bitterness either. Just exhaustion. Outside, the storm clouds thickened over the mountains. Walter slowly stood from the table with visible effort, joints stiff beneath his old flannel shirt and wool coat. He moved carefully across the trailer, boots scraping against worn linoleum floors. Near the front door hung an old navy jacket faded almost gray with age. The seal patch on the shoulder was peeling at the edges. Walter slipped it on slowly. The coat still carried the faint scent of cedar and winter air. He paused near the mirror beside the door. For a moment, he barely recognized the man staring back at him. 90 years old. Hollow cheeks. Snow-white stubble. Eyes still sharp beneath the weight of decades. Eyes that had seen too many boys become ghosts. Walter tucked the velvet metal box carefully into his coat pocket. Then he reached for his cane. The metal legs groaned softly beneath his weight as he stepped outside into the cold Montana. Morning. Snow crunched beneath his boots. The sky hung low and gray above the valley, heavy with another storm rolling in from the mountains. Walter pulled his collar tighter against the wind and began the slow walk toward town. Cars passed him without slowing. Young people inside warm trucks staring into phones. Coffee cups steaming behind glass. No one noticed the old man walking alone beside the icy road. No one noticed the final medal resting inside his pocket. And far across town, inside a black Ford pickup parked outside Carson's grocery market, a sable-coated German shepherd suddenly lifted his head toward the falling snow and stared silently toward the road, as if he had heard something the rest of the world had forgotten. The automatic doors of Carson's grocery slid open with a tired mechanical groan as Walter stepped inside, bringing a gust of snow and cold air with him. The warmth hit his face gently, carrying the smell of fresh bread, canned soup, old coffee, and floor cleaner. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in long pale rows, washing everything in the soft, lifeless glow common to small-town grocery stores that never really changed through the years. Walter paused near the entrance for a moment to steady himself. Snow melted slowly from the shoulders of his navy coat onto the rubber mat beneath his boots. Around him, shopping carts rattled softly across tile floors while quiet country music drifted from ceiling speakers somewhere overhead. Nobody looked at him twice. Just another old man in winter. Invisible in the way old age often becomes invisible. Walter adjusted his grip on the cane and slowly made his way through the aisles. He passed stacks of discounted cereal boxes, canned vegetables, paper towels, frozen dinners. His tired eyes moved carefully over yellow price tags, as if every number carried weight. Because now they did. He stopped beside the dairy section and stared at a gallon of milk for several seconds before placing the cheaper half-gallon into his basket instead. Nearby, a young mother laughed softly while her little boy reached for chocolate pudding cups. Walter watched them only briefly before lowering his eyes again. The sound reminded him too much of another lifetime. Another kitchen. Another family. Near the bakery section, he picked up a loaf of wheat bread and checked the expiration date out of habit. The bread felt warm through the plastic wrapping. Fresh. For a second, it brought back the memory of Mary standing barefoot in their old kitchen on Sunday mornings, flour dusted across her cheek, while she baked homemade rolls before church. Walter swallowed hard and placed the bread carefully into the basket. By the time he reached the checkout lanes, he had only 5 items. Bread, milk, eggs, a can of beef stew, generic coffee. The basket looked painfully light resting against the register conveyor belt. Register number 3 stood open beneath a flickering light. The cashier was a college-aged girl with freckles and tired eyes wearing a green store apron one size too big. Her name tag read Haley. She offered Walter a polite smile as he slowly unloaded his groceries one item at a time. "Cold one out there today?" she said gently. Walter nodded once. "Feels like January forgot it is only November." Haley gave a small, awkward laugh while scanning the items. Beep, beep, beep. The register sounds echoed strangely loud in the quiet lane. Walter reached slowly into his coat pocket while the numbers climbed across the screen. $26.40. His hand stopped inside the pocket. He already knew before looking. The wallet felt nearly empty. 2 wrinkled dollar bills. Some loose change. Not enough. His shoulders lowered slightly beneath the old navy coat. Haley noticed immediately. Her expression softened. "It is okay, sir. We can put something back if you need." Walter stood very still for a moment. The line behind him began growing. A man in construction gear checked his watch impatiently. Somewhere farther back, somebody sighed. Walter slowly removed the small velvet box from his coat pocket. The movement alone seemed to age him another 10 years. Haley frowned slightly as he opened it with trembling fingers beneath the register lights. The purple heart rested inside like a piece of buried history nobody asked to remember anymore. The ribbon looked faded, almost gray. Beneath the fluorescent glow, Walter cleared his throat softly. "Would this cover the difference?" he asked quietly. Haley blinked in confusion. "Sir." Walter tried again, forcing the words out through visible embarrassment. "Pawn shops are closed this early." I figured maybe he stopped. The sentence could not finish itself. Behind him, silence spread slowly through the checkout lane. Even the country music overhead suddenly seemed far away. Haley stared at the metal, then back at Walter's face. Her eyes widened slightly as realization settled in. "Sir, I cannot take that." Walter nodded faintly as though he had expected the answer all along. "It is all right." He began reaching weakly toward the bread to remove it first. "I do not need everything." At that exact moment, the front door slid open again beneath a burst of wind and swirling snow. Boots stepped heavily across the entry mat. A tall man entered carrying the cold with him. Ethan Cole, 34 years old. Broad shoulders beneath a dark flannel jacket. Short brown hair, still damp with melted snow. A faded Marine Corps cap, pulled low above sharp hazel eyes. Along his right forearm, partially visible beneath his sleeve, stretched the black ink outline of a German shepherd beside military coordinates etched into skin. Walking beside him moved Ranger. Large, sable-coated, calm in the way only highly trained dogs ever truly are. The shepherd's paws clicked softly against tile as customers instinctively moved aside to let them pass. Ethan carried a basket loosely in one hand, but Ranger stopped walking almost immediately after entering. His ears lifted sharply. Amber eyes locked down aisle 3 toward the checkout lanes. The dog froze completely. Ethan noticed at once. "What is it, buddy?" he murmured quietly. Ranger did not move. His posture changed in that subtle, focused way Ethan had learned never to ignore. The shepherd's nose twitched once toward the air. Then again. Slowly, Ranger began walking forward on his own, past the frozen foods, past the holiday display stacked with canned cranberry sauce, straight toward register number 3. Ethan followed silently behind him, curiosity growing. With every step, at the register, Walter had already begun removing the eggs from the counter with shaking hands when Ranger suddenly appeared beside him. The German shepherd stopped inches from the old man's side and sat down quietly without command. No bark, no growl, just stillness. Then, very gently, Ranger rested his large head against Walter's trembling hand. Walter froze. His fingers instinctively curled into the thick fur around the shepherd's neck. Warm, alive, loyal. The old man's breath caught sharply in his chest. For the first time that morning, his eyes finally lifted completely from the floor. Walter's fingers trembled against Ranger's thick sable fur as the German shepherd remained perfectly still beside him. The dog's amber eyes never left the old man's face. There was something almost human in the quiet patience of that gaze. Something gentle, understanding. For several long seconds, Walter simply stared down at the shepherd as though trying to remember a language he had not spoken in decades. Around them, the checkout lane had fallen silent. Even the impatient construction worker behind the cart lowered his eyes awkwardly toward the floor. Ethan stepped forward slowly, boots soft against the tile. Snow still clung to the shoulders of his jacket, melting in tiny dark patches. "Sorry about that," he said quietly to Haley. "He usually knows something before I do." Haley glanced nervously between the metal resting on the counter and the old man standing beside the dog. "Sir was trying to pay for groceries with this," she whispered gently. Ethan's eyes shifted downward toward the Purple Heart. The moment he saw it, his expression changed completely. Not shock, recognition, respect. The kind veterans carry for each other without needing words. Ethan removed his Marine cap slowly. Walter noticed that immediately. Old habits, old courtesies, the things younger generations often forgot. Ethan looked back at Walter carefully. "You served?" he asked softly. Walter hesitated before answering. "Long time ago." His voice carried the weight of someone unused to speaking about himself. Ethan nodded once. "Same here." Ranger shifted closer beside Walter and lightly pressed his nose against the old man's wrist again. Walter's breathing became uneven for a moment. It had been years since anything living had approached him with trust instead of pity. Ethan reached into his wallet without another word and handed Haley a $50 bill. "Everything in his basket," he said. "And add another week of groceries, too." Walter immediately stiffened. "No." The word came sharper than expected. Proud. Defensive. "I did not ask for charity." Ethan looked at him calmly. "I know." Walter's jaw tightened slightly beneath his white stubble. Around them, customers pretended not to watch while secretly listening to every word. "Then do not buy my food." Ethan rested one hand gently on Ranger's back. "It is not charity, sir." He glanced toward the medals still lying on the checkout counter beneath the fluorescent lights. "It is respect." Silence settled between them again. Haley quietly continued scanning additional groceries into bags while pretending not to notice the emotion thickening the air around register 3. Ethan's gaze lingered on the Purple Heart for another second before he spoke again. "Navy." Walter nodded faintly. "SEAL teams." Ethan exhaled softly through his nose. "That explains Ranger." Walter frowned slightly. "The dog." Ethan nodded. "He does not sit with strangers." Walter looked down at the shepherd again. Ranger remained planted firmly beside him, calm and unmoving despite the noise of carts and voices surrounding them. One of Walter's weathered hands slowly scratched behind the dog's ear almost without thinking. Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor. Small, quiet, but enough. Ethan noticed it immediately and smiled faintly for the first time that morning. That definitely explains it. Near the self-checkout area, a young man wearing an expensive winter jacket had quietly raised his phone during the exchange. Maybe 22 years old. Sharp haircut. White sneakers too clean for Montana snow. He tilted the screen toward Walter and muttered under his breath while recording. Man, this is crazy. Dude is out here trading army trophies for groceries. Ethan heard it instantly. So did Ranger. The shepherd's ears snapped backward. A low rumble vibrated deep in his chest. Not aggressive. Protective. Ethan slowly turned his head toward the young man. The Marine's expression did not harden. Somehow that made it heavier. Calmer. Colder. Turn it off, Ethan said quietly. The young man blinked. Relax, man. It is just content. Ethan stepped forward once. Nothing dramatic. Just enough for the room to feel smaller. That medal was earned by someone willing to die for people he never met. His voice remained low and steady. Including you. The young man shifted awkwardly and lowered the phone slightly. Ethan continued. So if you are looking for entertainment, look somewhere else. The silence afterward felt enormous. The young man swallowed hard, shoved the phone into his pocket, and backed toward another aisle without another word. Walter stared at Ethan for several seconds with unreadable eyes. Finally, he muttered quietly, You did not have to do that. Ethan shrugged once. Yeah, I did. Haley finished bagging the groceries and carefully handed the purple heart back across the counter instead of the receipt. Walter looked at it for a long moment before slowly taking it back into his hands. The old ribbon trembled slightly between his fingers. Thank you, Haley whispered softly. Walter blinked in confusion. For what? Her eyes looked glassy now. For serving. Walter looked away immediately, uncomfortable beneath gratitude. Men from his generation rarely knew what to do with praise. Ethan picked up the grocery bags before Walter could protest. Ranger stood smoothly beside them both, alert but calm again now that the tension had passed. Outside the front windows, snow continued drifting steadily across the parking lot beneath the gray Montana sky. Walter reached for his cane, but Ethan spoke before he could move. Where are you parked? Walter hesitated. I walked. Ethan frowned slightly. In this weather? Walter gave the faintest shrug. Trailer is about 2 miles north. Ethan glanced toward the storm building outside. The temperature had dropped sharply since morning. Ice now coated the edges of parked trucks beneath the falling snow. No chance. Ethan said quietly. We are driving you home. Walter immediately shook his head. I cannot ask you for that. Ethan adjusted the grocery bags in one hand. Good thing you did not. Ranger stepped closer to Walter again, as if already agreeing with the decision. The old man looked down at the dog, and something inside his face softened. Just slightly. Almost invisible unless you knew grief well enough to recognize the moment it loosened its grip for the first time. Walter slowly slipped the purple heart back into the velvet box and tucked it carefully inside his coat pocket near his chest. Near his heart, where it belonged. Then together, beneath the dim grocery store lights and the quiet watch of strangers suddenly remembering what dignity looked like, the old Navy SEAL walked beside the Marine and his loyal German shepherd toward the falling snow outside. The cold hit harder once the grocery store doors closed behind them. Snow drifted sideways across the parking lot beneath the pale afternoon sky, hissing softly against rows of parked trucks and frozen shopping carts. Ethan led the way toward his black Ford pickup while Ranger stayed close beside Walter, matching the old man's slow, uneven pace as if he had known him for years instead of minutes. Walter gripped his cane tightly with one hand while the other held the front of his coat closed against the wind. His breathing looked shallow now in the bitter air. Every exhale curled white into the storm. Ethan opened the passenger door carefully and set the grocery bags inside before turning back toward Walter. Easy step, he said quietly. Walter gave a faint nod and slowly climbed into the truck with visible effort. Ranger waited until the old man settled into the seat before jumping smoothly into the back. The inside of the truck smelled faintly of leather, pine cleaner, coffee, and dog fur warmed by old heater vents. It felt lived in. Human. Walter sat stiffly at first, hands folded over the handle of his cane, while snowflakes melted slowly along the sleeves of his navy coat. Ethan climbed behind the wheel and started the engine. The heater rattled awake after a moment, pushing warm air through the cab. Country radio played softly in the background before Ethan reached over and lowered the volume almost all the way down. For several minutes they drove through town in silence. Snow covered the rooftops of Kalispell in soft white layers, while Christmas lights already glowed faintly across storefront windows, even though Thanksgiving had not arrived yet. Walter watched everything through the passenger window with the distant look of someone remembering a world that no longer belonged to him. Ranger rested his head between the front seats, eyes quietly fixed on the old man. At a stoplight near the edge of town, Ethan finally spoke. "How long have you lived out there?" Walter kept his eyes on the falling snow outside. "Since Mary passed." Ethan nodded once. "Your wife?" Walter's jaw tightened slightly before he answered. 48 years together." The truck fell quiet again except for the low hum of tires rolling over slush. Ethan understood enough not to rush silence. Men like Walter carried grief the same way old soldiers carried scars. Quietly. Permanently. A few miles later, the road narrowed into a frozen county route lined with dark pine trees bending beneath heavy snow. The farther they drove from town, the lonelier everything became. Mailboxes leaned crooked beneath ice. Small cabins disappeared behind drifts. Smoke curled from chimneys into the gray afternoon sky. Finally, Walter pointed ahead through the windshield with one trembling finger. "That one." Ethan slowed near an aging trailer tucked behind a cluster of bare cottonwood trees. The place looked tired before the truck even stopped. Rust streaked the aluminum siding beneath the windows. One porch step sagged badly to the left. A blue tarp covered part of the roof, where snow had begun collecting heavily along the edges. The American flag near the door hung faded and stiff from winter wind. Ethan parked quietly. For a moment, nobody moved. Walter stared at the trailer with an expression too complicated for words. Embarrassment, pride, loneliness, maybe all three. "It is not much," he muttered finally. Ethan glanced toward him. "Looks warm enough to me." Walter gave the faintest humorless smile. "Only if the heater feels cooperative." Ethan grabbed the grocery bags before Walter could protest again. Ranger jumped down from the back seat and immediately trotted toward the trailer steps, sniffing carefully through the snow-covered porch. Walter unlocked the front door slowly with shaking hands. The trailer smelled faintly of cedar, old books, dust, and stale coffee the moment they stepped inside. The heat was weak but present. A small electric heater buzzed loudly near the kitchen table while yellow lamplight softened the cramped, narrow room. Everything inside looked worn but carefully maintained. Old military photographs lined the walls beside framed fishing pictures and faded newspaper clippings. A younger Walter stood in black and white photographs beside teams of men smiling beneath helicopters and jungle trees. In every picture, the men looked impossibly young. Ranger moved quietly through the trailer with calm curiosity, nails clicking softly across the linoleum floor. He paused near a recliner covered by an old green blanket and sniffed the air before circling once and laying down beside it, as though he had already chosen his post. Ethan carried the groceries into the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator to put away the milk and froze for half a second. Empty shelves. Almost nothing inside except old condiments and the half carton of milk Walter had mentioned earlier. Ethan said nothing. He simply began quietly stocking the refrigerator one item at a time. Bread, eggs, stew, coffee. Walter watched from the doorway with unreadable eyes. "You did not need to buy all that," he said softly. Ethan closed the refrigerator door gently. "Yeah," he answered. "I did." Walter lowered himself slowly into one of the kitchen chairs with visible exhaustion. The old wood creaked beneath his weight. He removed his gloves carefully, revealing hands marked by age and winter cold. Ranger immediately rose from the recliner and crossed the room to rest beside Walter's boots. The shepherd leaned lightly against the old man's leg without hesitation. Walter looked down at him, and something shifted quietly in his face again. Something softer this time. "He reminds me of another dog," Walter murmured. Ethan leaned against the counter. "Military." Walter nodded slowly. "Vietnam. Belgian Malinois named Duke." His voice grew distant with memory. "Smarter than most men I knew." Ranger's ears twitched at the sound of the old man's voice. Walter reached down carefully and scratched behind the shepherd's ears. Saved 6 lives during a flood evacuation near Da Nang. Ethan folded his arms quietly and listened. Outside, snow tapped softly against the trailer windows while the sky darkened toward evening. The world beyond the trees felt far away now. Smaller somehow. Safer. Walter stared at Ranger for a long moment before speaking again. When Duke died, he stopped. Swallowed once. I never got another dog after that. Ethan noticed the slight tremor returning to the old man's hands. Not from cold this time. From memory. Ranger slowly rested his large head directly across Walter's knee. The old Navy SEAL froze beneath the weight of that simple gesture. Then very carefully, almost like a man afraid the moment might disappear if he moved too fast, Walter placed one weathered hand over the shepherd's head and closed his eyes. For the first time in many years, the trailer no longer felt entirely empty. Evening settled slowly over the Montana Valley, wrapping the trailer and surrounding pines in deep blue shadow while snow continued falling beyond the windows in soft, endless waves. Inside, the small kitchen glowed with warm amber light from an aging lamp near the sink. The heater buzzed unevenly against the cold pressing from outside, but somehow the trailer already felt different than it had only hours earlier. Less hollow, less forgotten. Walter sat quietly at the kitchen table while Ethan brewed fresh coffee, using an old percolator he found tucked beside the stove. The rich smell gradually filled the trailer, blending with cedar wood and the faint scent of snow melting from boots left near the door. Ranger remained beside Walter's chair, stretched across the floor with one paw resting lightly against the old man's boot, as though guarding him from disappearing again. Walter stared down at that paw for a long moment before speaking softly. Mary always wanted a dog after Duke died. Ethan glanced over from the counter. What stopped you? Walter leaned back slowly in the chair, eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the trailer walls. Fear, maybe. His voice carried no drama. Only honesty. You spend enough years losing people. Eventually you stop wanting anything you might love again. The coffee pot rattled softly between them. Ethan understood that kind of silence. He had seen it in barracks rooms after funerals. In veterans sitting alone outside hardware stores staring at nothing. In mirrors during bad nights when sleep refused to come. He poured 2 cups and carried one carefully to Walter. Black. Walter gave a faint nod. Ethan sat across from him at the table while Ranger lifted his head briefly before settling again beside Walter's leg. Steam curled upward between the 2 men. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the trailer's siding like distant surf. For several minutes neither spoke. They simply drank coffee while the storm deepened outside. Then Walter's eyes drifted toward Ethan's right forearm, where the German Shepherd tattoo remained partly visible beneath his rolled sleeve. The old man narrowed his eyes slightly. That your dog? Ethan glanced down at the tattoo and gave a faint smile. Not exactly. Walter waited quietly. Ethan rubbed his thumb once along the coffee mug before answering. There was another shepherd before Ranger. His name was Atlas. Ranger's ears twitched at the unfamiliar name, but he remained still. Ethan's expression softened with memory. Atlas served 3 tours with me overseas. Smartest dog I ever knew. Could detect explosives before the equipment did. Walter listened without interrupting. Saved my life twice, Ethan continued quietly. Maybe more. The Marine paused for a moment, eyes fixed on the steam rising from his coffee. Last deployment ended badly. We lost contact during a sandstorm outside Kandahar. Atlas found me before the rescue team did. Walter noticed Ethan's jaw tightened slightly beneath the calmness. But he did not make it home. The heater hummed loudly in the silence that followed. Ranger slowly lifted his head and rested his chin across Walter's knee again, sensing the shift in emotion before either man spoke another word. Walter reached down automatically, fingers stroking the shepherd's fur with slow, absent movements. That is why you got him. Ethan nodded once. Ranger came from the same training bloodline. A faint smile crossed his face. Different personality, though. Atlas was all business. Ranger thinks he is part therapist. Walter looked down at the dog. Maybe he is. Ethan laughed quietly under his breath. The sound felt strange inside the trailer at first, like laughter had not visited in a very long time. Ranger's tail thumped softly once against the floor. Walter stared into his coffee cup for a while before speaking again. You know what the hardest part is? Ethan looked up. Walter's eyes remained fixed on the dark liquid swirling faintly inside the mug. People think war changes you because of the things you saw. His voice grew quieter, slower. Truth is, it is what comes after. Snow hissed softly against the windows. You come home. Everybody claps. Calls you hero. Thanks you for your service. Walter swallowed once. Then years pass. Friends die. Wives get sick. Sons lose themselves. His fingers tightened slightly around the coffee mug. And one day you wake up 90 years old trying to decide whether a medal is worth more than bread. Ethan said nothing because there was nothing respectful enough to say to that kind of truth. Walter gave the faintest shake of his head. Funny thing is, I was not ashamed of being hungry. He glanced toward the velvet box resting near the table edge. I was ashamed somebody might see me selling memory. Ranger slowly pushed his nose against Walter's hand again. The old man looked down at him, and his face softened with visible pain. Dogs understand dignity better than people sometimes. Ethan nodded quietly. Yeah. The storm outside thickened. Snow piled heavily along the trailer windows, while distant pine branches creaked beneath the wind. Somewhere far off, a church bell rang 7 times through the valley. Walter leaned back carefully in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. The warm coffee, the heater, the dog resting against his leg, the simple sound of another human being breathing nearby. It had been years since the trailer felt this alive. Ranger suddenly lifted his head sharply and stood. His ears focused toward the hallway leading deeper into the trailer. Ethan immediately noticed the shift. What is it, buddy? Ranger moved slowly down the narrow hallway without barking. Walter frowned slightly. Probably smells mice behind the walls. But Ranger ignored the comment and continued toward the small bedroom near the back. Ethan followed after him while Walter slowly rose with his cane and came behind them. The bedroom looked frozen in time. Old fishing gear leaned in one corner beside stacked cardboard boxes and military duffel bags coated in dust. A faded quilt covered the bed beneath framed photographs lining the walls. Mary smiling beside a Christmas tree. A younger Walter holding a little blonde-haired boy on his shoulders near Flathead Lake. Ranger sniffed carefully near the bed before lowering himself onto the floor and pushing his nose beneath the frame. His tail gave one slow sweep. Ethan crouched beside him. Find something. Ranger pawed once beneath the bed. A dull scraping sound echoed softly against the floorboards. Walter's expression changed slightly. That cannot be right. Ethan reached beneath the bed and slowly pulled out a small weathered metal box covered in dust. Walter froze the moment he saw it. His breathing became shallow. I have not seen that in 40 years, he whispered. The metal box looked smaller than something capable of carrying 40 years of memory. Dust coated its surface in pale gray layers, and rust crept along the hinges like old age settling into bone. Ethan placed it carefully on the edge of the bed while Ranger sat beside him, alert and strangely still. Walter remained frozen near the bedroom doorway, one hand gripping the cane so tightly his knuckles whitened beneath the skin. The heater hummed faintly from the kitchen while snow whispered against the trailer roof overhead. For a moment, nobody moved. Walter stared at the box with the expression of a man standing before a grave he never intended to visit again. Mary hid it after my son left, he said quietly. His voice sounded far away now. Said I kept living in ghosts. Ethan glanced toward him. What is inside? Walter swallowed once before answering. Everything I could not bury. The old Navy SEAL slowly crossed the room and lowered himself onto the edge of the bed with visible effort. The mattress springs groaned softly beneath his weight. Ranger moved closer immediately, settling near Walter's boots as if understanding the importance of what sat between them. Walter reached forward carefully and brushed dust from the lid with trembling fingers. Beneath the grime, faded black lettering appeared scratched into the metal. Hayes, 1972. Ethan noticed Walter hesitate before opening it. Not fear exactly. Something deeper. Like grief becoming physical. Finally, the latch clicked open with a dry metallic sound. Inside rested decades compressed into silence. Old photographs bound with rubber bands brittle from age. Military patches faded by time. Dog tags. Letters tied together with blue ribbon. A folded American flag carefully wrapped in plastic. The faint smell of old paper and cedar drifted upward from the box, as though memory itself carried a scent. Walter stared down without speaking. Ethan remained quiet beside him. Men from war learned early that silence was often the purest form of respect. Ranger lowered his head onto Walter's knee again. The old man's hand instinctively rested against the shepherd's fur while his eyes moved slowly through the contents. Then he stopped. Near the bottom of the box rested a sealed envelope yellowed with age. The handwriting across the front had faded but remained legible beneath the bedroom lamp. Commander Walter Hayes. Personal. Walter's breathing changed instantly. Ethan noticed it at once. You okay? Walter did not answer immediately. His eyes remained locked on the envelope as though it might disappear if he blinked. I never opened this, he whispered. Who sent it? Walter's fingers hovered uncertainly above the paper. Tommy's mother. Silence settled heavily across the room. Ethan remembered the name from earlier that morning. Sorry, Tommy. Walter slowly picked up the envelope. The paper crackled softly in his hands. She mailed it after they brought him home. His voice grew thinner now. Older somehow. I could never make myself read it. Ethan leaned quietly against the wall beside the dresser, giving the old man space while snow continued piling against the trailer outside. Walter stared at the envelope for a very long time. The edges shook slightly between his fingers. Tommy Reed was 19 when I met him, he said softly. Could not grow a decent beard to save his life. Alabama farm kid. Talked nonstop. A faint smile flickered briefly across Walter's face before fading again. Always carried peppermint candy in his pockets because he said jungle air smelled like wet boots. Ethan listened carefully while Ranger remained perfectly still beside the bed. Walter looked toward the small bedroom window where darkness now pressed fully against the glass. One night our extraction got delayed near Da Nang after a flood swept through nearby villages. His eyes drifted far away with memory. Civilians trapped. Children mostly. The heater buzzed softly in the distance. Tommy stayed behind helping load families onto rescue helicopters. Walter's jaw tightened once. Storm got worse before the last transport cleared. He stopped there. Did not describe the rest. He did not need to. Some grief explained itself through silence. Ethan lowered his eyes respectfully. Walter slowly turned the envelope over in his hands. The seal remained untouched after 4 decades. Mary begged me to read it. His voice cracked slightly. But every time I tried, he shook his head faintly. It felt like opening the door to something I barely survived. Ranger lifted his muzzle gently and nudged Walter's wrist. The old man looked down at the shepherd for several seconds. Then, with visible effort, he slid one finger carefully beneath the envelope flap. The paper tore softly through the quiet room. Walter unfolded the letter with trembling hands while Ethan remained motionless nearby. Snow rattled lightly against the roof above them. Walter's tired eyes moved slowly across the first lines, then stopped. His breathing caught sharply. Ethan saw moisture gather instantly along the old man's lower eyelids. Walter swallowed hard before reading aloud in a voice barely stronger than a whisper. Dear Commander Hayes, there are mothers who spend their lives wondering whether their sons died alone. His voice faltered. Ranger pressed closer against his leg. Walter continued slowly. Because of you. I know mine did not. The room fell completely silent except for the faint hum of winter wind outside. Walter's hand shook harder now as he kept reading. Tommy wrote about you often. He said you carried scared boys through darkness like they still mattered. Ethan looked away briefly toward the hallway, giving the old man dignity while emotion thickened the air around them. Walter pressed trembling fingers against his mouth. Tears finally slipped down the deep lines of his face without resistance now. Quiet tears. The kind old soldiers saved for private places when nobody remained to judge them. He stared at the final line of the letter for a long time before whispering it aloud. Thank you for bringing my son home when God could not. Walter lowered the paper slowly into his lap. The years seemed to settle heavily across his shoulders all at once. Ethan stepped forward quietly and placed one steady hand against the old man's shoulder. Nothing dramatic, just presence. Walter closed his eyes tightly. All these years, he whispered. I thought I failed him. Ranger slowly rested his head against Walter's chest beneath the old navy coat, and for the first time in decades, the old man finally allowed himself to grieve not like a soldier, but like a human being. The trailer remained quiet long after Walter finished reading the letter. Outside, the Montana storm pressed harder against the valley, covering the world beyond the windows in endless white silence. Snow gathered thick along the porch railings and buried the old tire tracks leading toward the road. Inside the bedroom, the small lamp near the dresser cast a soft golden glow across photographs, faded uniforms, and the open metal box resting on the bed like a wound finally uncovered after decades. Walter sat motionless beside it, the letter still trembling faintly in his hands. Ranger remained close against him, warm and steady beneath the old man's palm. Ethan stood near the doorway without speaking. Some moments became smaller if words touched them too quickly. Walter finally removed his glasses with shaking fingers and wiped his eyes slowly with the sleeve of his flannel shirt. He looked exhausted now in a deeper way than age alone could explain, like a man who had spent half a century carrying guilt that never belonged to him. "Mary used to tell me surviving can become its own kind of loneliness," he murmured softly. Ethan lowered himself into the old chair beside the bedroom window. "She sounds smart." A faint, tired smile touched Walter's face. "She was." He stared down at the letter again. "Met her at a diner outside Coronado in 1968. I still had sand in my boots from training." The old man's eyes softened with memory. "She said I looked hungry enough to eat the menu." Ethan laughed quietly under his breath. Walter smiled faintly too, and for a brief moment the years seemed to peel back from his face. "She waited through deployments, through surgeries, through nightmares." His voice lowered again. "I do not think people understand what military wives survive." Ethan nodded slowly. "No, most people do not." Ranger shifted slightly beside Walter, his tail brushing softly against the worn rug. The shepherd watched the old man constantly now, as though guarding something fragile that had finally begun to reopen. Walter carefully folded Tommy's letter and slid it back into the envelope with surprising tenderness. "After Mary died," he whispered, "the house stopped sounding alive. The wind rattled faintly against the trailer siding. Then my son started slipping away too." Ethan listened quietly while Walter stared at the floor beneath his boots. "Daniel was a good kid once. Smart. Funny." His tired eyes drifted toward one of the photographs hanging near the dresser. A blonde-haired teenager smiling beside a fishing boat under summer sunlight. But grief hits people different. Walter swallowed hard. "I buried Mary." He buried himself. Silence settled heavily around the room. Ranger slowly rested his head against Walter's knee. "Again. He passed 3 winters ago," Walter continued softly. "Overdose in Spokane." Ethan lowered his eyes respectfully. Walter's face remained calm, but the pain beneath it felt ancient now. After that, he glanced slowly around the cramped trailer. "I stopped opening curtains. Stopped answering calls. Stopped going anywhere besides the grocery store and church once a month." The heater buzzed unevenly in the hallway. "Funny thing about loneliness," Walter said quietly. "After a while, it starts feeling safer than hope." Ethan leaned back slightly in the chair, studying the old veteran carefully. "You know what I think?" Walter looked over. Ethan rubbed one hand slowly across Ranger's back. "I think people like you spent your whole lives protecting everyone else." He paused briefly. "But nobody ever taught you how to let people protect you back." Walter stared at him silently for several seconds. The words landed somewhere deep, somewhere old. Ranger suddenly lifted his head and looked toward the front of the trailer. His ears twitched once. Ethan noticed immediately. "Someone outside?" Walter frowned slightly. "Probably just branches." But then came a faint crunch of tires through snow beyond the porch. Headlights swept briefly across the bedroom curtains before fading still. Walter looked confused. "Nobody visits me." Ethan stood carefully while Ranger moved toward the hallway with alert but calm posture. A vehicle door closed outside. Then another. Boots crunched slowly across deep snow toward the porch steps. Walter's expression tightened slightly with uncertainty. Ethan stepped into the narrow living room first while Ranger remained beside him. Through the frosted front window, silhouettes appeared beneath the porch light. 3 figures bundled in heavy winter coats carrying something large between them. Then came a knock. Soft. Respectful. Walter slowly approached the door using his cane while Ethan stayed nearby. The old Navy SEAL opened the door carefully against the wind. Cold air rushed inside, carrying the scent of pine and snow. Standing on the porch were 3 older men around Walter's age wearing thick flannel jackets and veterans' caps dusted white with snowflakes. One wore an army patch, another Air Force. The The third carried a faded Marine Corps emblem stitched across his hat. In their hands rested several stacked firewood bundles and 2 paper grocery sacks. For a second, nobody spoke. Then the Marine veteran cleared his throat awkwardly. "Heard your heater's been acting up again, Walt." Walter blinked in confusion. "Frank." The old Marine gave a small nod. "Haley from Carson's called my wife after you left the store." He shifted the firewood in his arms. "Said maybe you could use some company." Walter stood frozen in the doorway as snow drifted around them beneath the yellow porch light. The Army veteran lifted one grocery sack slightly. "Brought venison stew too. Clara made extra." Nobody smiled too much. Nobody made it dramatic. Just old men standing quietly in the snow pretending this was the most ordinary thing in the world. Walter's eyes grew glassy again almost immediately. "You boys drove all the way out here in this storm?" Frank shrugged once beneath his coat. "Well, somebody had to make sure an old frogman was still breathing." Ethan stepped back silently while Ranger relaxed beside the doorway, tail moving softly against the floor. Walter looked from face to face on the porch like a man seeing ghosts return one by one from another lifetime. Then very slowly, the old Navy SEAL stepped aside and opened the trailer door wider. "You better come in before you freeze to death," he whispered. Warmth slowly returned to the trailer in ways that had nothing to do with the heater. Wet boots lined the doorway beneath dripping coats while snow melted into small puddles across the worn linoleum floor. The cramped living room filled with the deep, familiar sounds of older men settling into chairs, clearing throats, trading quiet insults that carried affection beneath every word. Ranger moved calmly among them, tail low and relaxed, accepting rough scratches behind the ears from weathered hands that smelled faintly of tobacco, sawdust, and winter air. Walter stood near the kitchen table watching it all unfold with visible disbelief, like a man who had spent too many years abandoned by silence to trust. "Noise anymore." Frank Miller, the retired Marine, carried the firewood toward the old cast-iron stove near the corner while the former Army medic named Harold unpacked containers of homemade stew from the grocery sack. The Air Force veteran, Leonard, removed his knit cap and immediately frowned toward the ceiling. "Your roof still leaking over there?" Walter glanced upward automatically. "Only when God feels dramatic." Leonard grunted. "Looks like he has been downright theatrical lately." Ethan quietly watched the exchange from the kitchen counter while sipping lukewarm coffee. He noticed something changing inside Walter with every passing minute. The old Navy SEAL still looked tired, still worn by grief and age. But the emptiness around him had started cracking open just enough for light to reach through. Frank finished stacking fresh logs beside the stove and looked toward Walter. "You got whiskey hidden in this place, or are we suffering sober tonight?" Walter blinked once before the faintest genuine smile appeared beneath his white stubble. "Top cabinet above the sink." Harold laughed softly. "There he is." Ethan glanced toward Ranger as the shepherd settled near Walter's chair once again, like he had assigned himself permanent duty there. "He likes you," Ethan said quietly. Walter lowered himself carefully into the recliner while Ranger rested across his boots. "Maybe he just pities old men." "No," Ethan answered softly. "Dogs do not stay close out of pity." The room fell into a comfortable silence after that. Outside, the storm continued swallowing the valley in white darkness while inside the trailer glowed with soft amber light and the rich smell of venison stew warming on the stove. Leonard eventually wandered toward the hallway carrying a toolbox he had brought in from the truck. "Your bathroom sink's still leaking too." Walter nodded. "Probably." Leonard sighed dramatically. "Retirement is just unpaid maintenance work for old friends." The others chuckled quietly. Ethan leaned back against the kitchen counter and watched Walter carefully. The old man's eyes moved slowly across the room from face to face. Frank laughing softly near the stove. Harold arranging bowls on the table. Leonard muttering to himself from the hallway while tightening pipes. Ordinary moments. Small moments. But they carried something sacred inside them. Presence. Walter suddenly looked toward Ethan. "You know what the strangest part is?" Ethan shook his head slightly. Walter glanced around the trailer again. "This morning I thought I was preparing to disappear." The words settled heavily into the room. Nobody interrupted him. Funny how quickly God changes directions sometimes. Frank quietly poured 2 fingers of whiskey into an old glass and handed it toward Walter. To not disappearing. Walter accepted the glass slowly. His fingers trembled slightly around it. To old fools who refuse to stay gone, he replied softly. The men raised their cups in silent agreement. Ranger's tail thumped gently once against the floorboards. Hours passed quietly after that. Snow continued falling outside, while stories slowly surfaced around the kitchen table like old songs remembered piece by piece. Harold told embarrassing tales about army field kitchens during winter deployments in Germany. Frank swore every Marine mechanic since 1982 had been born angry. Leonard described accidentally locking himself inside a supply hangar during a blizzard in Alaska for 12 hours with nothing but powdered donuts and instant coffee. Even Walter began talking more, at first cautiously, then naturally, like a man rediscovering the sound of his own voice after years buried beneath grief. Ethan mostly listened. He noticed how Ranger never strayed far from Walter the entire evening. The shepherd watched the old man constantly with calm, attentive eyes, sensing every emotional shift before it happened. At one point, Walter dropped a spoon while reaching across the table. Before anyone else could react, Ranger nudged the utensil gently back toward him with his nose. The old Navy SEAL stared down at the dog in surprise before quietly scratching behind his ears. "You really are something else," he murmured. Ethan smiled faintly. He takes his job seriously. Near midnight, the storm finally began easing. The wind softened beyond the trailer walls while the fire crackled warmly beside the stove. Harold had fallen asleep briefly in the kitchen chair with his cap tilted over his eyes. Leonard finished repairing the sink and proudly announced it only leaked like a politician now instead of a waterfall. Frank quietly loaded more wood into the stove before turning toward Ethan. "You staying the night?" Ethan glanced toward the dark roads outside. Snow still covered most of the county highway. "Probably safer." Walter looked up immediately. "You can take the bedroom. I usually sleep out here anyway." Ethan shook his head. "Couch is fine." Walter hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Thank you." Ethan met his eyes calmly. "For what?" The old man looked down at Ranger resting beside his chair. "For reminding me I was still alive before it was too late." Silence settled softly across the trailer after that, the kind that did not feel lonely anymore. Ethan looked toward the old photographs lining the walls. Mary smiling beneath summer sunlight. Daniel holding fishing poles near the lake. Younger versions of Walter standing beside men long buried beneath military stone. A life measured in service, loss, endurance, and quiet love. Ranger slowly lifted his head and rested his muzzle against Walter's knee once more. The old man's weathered hand settled gently over the shepherd's fur without hesitation now. Outside, dawn still remained hours away. But somewhere deep beneath the grief, the cold, and the long silence of forgotten years, something small had finally begun to heal. Morning arrived slowly beneath a sky the color of steel. Snow covered the valley in thick, untouched layers that softened every rooftop, every fence line, every lonely stretch of road disappearing into the pines. The storm had finally passed during the night, leaving behind the kind of silence only winter could create. Inside the trailer, the smell of coffee and wood smoke drifted warmly through the narrow rooms while pale dawn light filtered gently through frost-covered windows. Walter sat at the kitchen table wrapped in an old wool blanket, watching steam rise from a fresh cup of coffee. Ranger lay stretched across the floor beside him, one ear twitching occasionally at the crackle of the stove. Ethan stood near the sink rinsing out mugs while Frank and Leonard argued quietly over whether the snowplow service in Kalispell had gotten worse or whether they were simply becoming old men who complained too much. Harold snored softly in the recliner with an untouched biscuit balanced dangerously on his chest. For the first time in years, the trailer sounded alive before sunrise. Walter looked around slowly at the scene unfolding inside his home. Men laughing softly, boots drying near the stove, coffee warming cold hands. A German shepherd sleeping peacefully at his feet. The old Navy SEAL lowered his eyes for a moment as emotion quietly tightened in his chest again. He had forgotten what company felt like. Forgotten the strange comfort of hearing another person moving around the kitchen before daylight. Ethan noticed the expression crossing Walter's face. "You all right?" Walter nodded faintly, just remembering. He glanced toward the frosted window. Mary used to love mornings like this. Leonard looked up from tightening his bootlaces. "The woman who made cinnamon rolls." Walter blinked in surprise. "You remember that?" Leonard snorted softly. "Half this county remembers that." Frank laughed under his breath. Your wife nearly caused a riot at St. Andrew's Church bake sale in 1993. A faint smile slowly spread across Walter's face. She cheated. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Cheated? Walter nodded solemnly. Extra butter. The room filled with low, warm laughter. Even Harold woke briefly long enough to mutter, "Worth it," before falling asleep again. Ranger lifted his head at the sound of laughter and looked around calmly before resting back down against Walter's boots. The old man scratched behind the shepherd's ears absent-mindedly, while snow glittered softly outside beneath growing daylight. Then came the sound of tires crunching through fresh snow near the road again. This time more than one vehicle. Ethan glanced toward the window automatically. You expecting more visitors? Walter frowned slightly. Nobody ever visits me. Frank walked carefully toward the front window and peered. Through the curtain, his eyebrows rose immediately. Well, looks like that changed. Walter slowly stood with his cane and moved beside him. Outside, 3 pickup trucks now sat near the trailer beneath the morning snow. Men climbed out carrying lumber, toolboxes, propane tanks, and bundles wrapped beneath tarps. Walter stared in confusion. What in the world? The front door opened before anyone could knock. Cold air rushed inside along with a younger man wearing a heavy Carhartt jacket dusted white with snow. Morning, Mr. Hayes, he said warmly. Heard your roof's leaking. Behind him came 2 more men carrying plywood sheets toward the porch. Another unloaded bags of groceries from the truck bed. Walter looked completely lost. Who sent all of you? The younger man removed his gloves awkwardly. Honestly, half the town, I think. Ethan exchanged a quiet glance with Frank. The man continued. That girl from Carson's grocery told her mom what happened yesterday. He shrugged. Word spreads fast around here. More vehicles slowly appeared near the road while he spoke. A woman in her 60s carrying casserole, dishes wrapped in towels. 2 teenage boys unloading split firewood. A retired electrician carrying coils of wire over one shoulder. Nobody acted dramatic about it. Nobody made speeches. They simply arrived and got to work. Walter stood near the doorway speechless while strangers and neighbors quietly moved around his trailer like people rebuilding something sacred. Ethan stepped closer beside him. Looks like you are not disappearing after all. Walter's eyes remained fixed on the growing crowd outside. Snow sparkled around them beneath pale winter sunlight while hammers, laughter, and truck doors echoed softly through the valley. Ranger stood beside Walter now, posture calm but attentive as if guarding the old man from being overwhelmed by kindness. A little girl wearing pink mittens cautiously approached the shepherd carrying a paper bag nearly half her size. Mama made blueberry muffins, she whispered shyly. Ranger sniffed her mitten gently before sitting politely beside Walter. The little girl smiled immediately. Your dog is beautiful. Walter looked down at Ranger with visible emotion softening his tired face. He belongs to him, he said quietly, nodding toward Ethan. The little girl tilted her head thoughtfully. Maybe. Then she carefully handed Walter the bag before running back through the snow toward her mother. Ethan watched the old man closely. Walter's hands trembled again while holding the warm paper bag against his chest. Not from cold this time. I do not understand this, he whispered. Frank rested one weathered hand against Walter's shoulder. That is because you spent too long believing people forgot. Nearby, Leonard had already climbed onto the roof muttering loudly about criminally irresponsible patch jobs, while the younger men passed him tools through the snow. Harold stood near the old heater outside the trailer discussing propane connections with an electrician. Smoke from fresh coffee drifted through the crisp mountain air as more neighbors slowly arrived carrying blankets, canned food, batteries, and winter supplies. Ethan leaned quietly against the porch railing watching the scene unfold, while Ranger remained planted faithfully beside Walter through it all. The old Navy SEAL stared across the crowded snowy yard with tears gathering slowly in his tired eyes once again. Not grief this time. Something gentler. Something far more dangerous after years alone. Hope. Walter looked toward Ethan after a long silence. Why would they do all this for me? Ethan glanced toward the townspeople working around the trailer beneath the pale Montana sun. Because somewhere along the way, he answered softly. People remembered what your medals were actually worth. By late afternoon, the trailer no longer looked abandoned. Smoke rose steadily from the repaired chimney into the pale Montana sky, while fresh plywood covered the damaged section of roof where snow had leaked through for nearly 2 winters. Tire tracks and boot prints crisscrossed the once empty yard. Voices drifted warmly through the cold air along with the sounds of hammers, laughter, and old country music crackling softly from somebody's truck radio. Walter stood near the porch wrapped in his navy coat, watching everything with quiet disbelief that still had not fully faded. Ranger remained beside him like a living shadow, calm amber eyes following every movement around the property. Children played near the snowbanks while older veterans argued over extension cords and propane fittings as though they had been assigned this mission years ago. Ethan carried another armload of split firewood toward the porch when he noticed Walter staring toward the old flagpole near the edge of the yard. The American flag hanging there looked worn, nearly transparent from years of weather. Frayed corners snapped weakly in the cold wind. Ethan set the firewood down carefully. How long has that flag been up there? Walter followed his gaze. Since Mary's funeral. Ethan looked closer. You never took it down? Walter shook his head slowly. Could not bring myself to. The old man's eyes lingered on the faded fabric for a moment. She folded it herself the morning before surgery. Said if she did not make it, his voice softened beneath the winter air. She wanted the house to still feel patriotic. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. Some grief stayed sacred no matter how many years passed. Nearby, Leonard climbed down from the roof, carrying his toolbox beneath one arm. Good news, he announced loudly. Your roof is ugly but functional. Frank laughed near the truck bed. That is basically Leonard's dating history too. A round of tired veteran laughter rolled across the yard, while Leonard muttered insults no one took seriously anymore. Walter smiled faintly despite himself. Ranger's ears twitched at the sound. Then suddenly a dark SUV slowly rolled up the snowy road and stopped near the mailbox. The vehicle looked expensive against the modest trucks surrounding the trailer. Clean black paint. Polished chrome. City tires not built for Montana winters. Ethan immediately noticed Walter's expression tighten slightly. A man stepped out wearing a charcoal wool coat and leather gloves. Mid-50s. Gray hair, neatly combed despite the wind. He carried a slim briefcase tucked beneath one arm while carefully navigating through the snow toward the porch. Conversations around the yard gradually quieted as people noticed the stranger approaching. Ranger stood smoothly beside Walter now, posture alert but controlled. The man removed his gloves politely once he reached the porch steps. Commander Hayes? Walter straightened slightly at the old title. Depends who is asking. The man offered a respectful nod. Richard Bennett. Montana Veterans Historical Foundation. Ethan quietly stepped closer beside Walter while the others continued watching from the yard. Bennett glanced around at the repairs and gathered neighbors before lowering his voice slightly. I heard about what happened at Carson's grocery yesterday. Walter's jaw tightened faintly with embarrassment. Bennett continued carefully. One of our board members recognized your name after the story spread online. Walter frowned. Online. Ethan glanced toward the ground knowingly. Somebody in town must have posted about the grocery store after all. Bennett opened his briefcase slowly and removed a folder wrapped carefully in plastic. Sir, we have been searching for you for nearly 6 years. Walter stared at him in confusion. Snow drifted softly around the porch while the entire yard seemed to hold its breath. Bennett handed him the folder. Your rescue operations during the Da Nang evacuations were archived improperly after the war. Walter's weathered hands slowly accepted the papers. Inside rested military photographs he had not seen in decades. Helicopters. Flooded villages. Young soldiers carrying children through waist-deep water. One photograph stopped him cold. Tommy Reed smiling beside Walter with mud covering both their uniforms while a military dog sat proudly between them. Duke. Walter's breathing faltered slightly. Bennett spoke gently now. 3 years ago, survivors from those evacuations began documenting eyewitness accounts for the foundation. He paused. Sir, there are over 40 civilians alive today because of your team. Silence swallowed the porch. Even the wind seemed quieter suddenly. Walter stared at the photograph like a man seeing buried years return from the dead. We would like to formally honor you next month at the Veterans Memorial Ceremony in Helena, Bennett said softly. And he hesitated briefly before continuing. The foundation would also like to purchase your Purple Heart and military archive collection for preservation. Walter's eyes slowly lifted from the papers. Ethan noticed the old tension immediately returning beneath his expression. How much? Walter asked quietly. Bennett named a number large enough to silence the entire porch. Frank muttered softly beneath his breath. Leonard nearly dropped his wrench. Walter himself looked almost startled. Bennett quickly continued. The collection would be displayed permanently under your name and your team's service history. Walter lowered his eyes toward the old photograph again. Tommy smiling beside Duke. Young men frozen forever before time could break them apart. Ranger pressed gently against Walter's leg beneath the porch railing. The old Navy SEAL stood completely still for several seconds while snow drifted quietly around them. Finally, he closed the folder carefully and handed it back. No, Bennett blinked in surprise. Sir. Walter looked toward the faded American flag moving softly in the winter wind above the yard. Those medals are not merchandise. His voice remained calm. Certain. They belong to memories. To people who never made it home. Bennett hesitated. We only hope to preserve your legacy. Walter glanced slowly around the crowded snowy yard. Neighbors repairing his roof. Veterans laughing beside firewood. Children playing near Ranger in the snow. Ethan standing quietly beside him beneath the fading winter light. The old man's eyes softened deeply. Looks to me like it survived just fine. Nobody spoke after that. Bennett stood silently for a long moment before finally nodding once with visible respect. Understood, Commander. He carefully returned the photographs to the briefcase. Then perhaps you will at least allow us to honor you properly. Walter looked down toward Ranger resting faithfully against his leg. A faint smile touched the old Navy SEAL's face. Maybe, he whispered softly. But only if the dog gets invited too. The days that followed settled over the valley with a strange kind of grace. Winter still ruled the mountains around. Kalispell, coating the roads in silver frost each morning and wrapping the pine forests in silence each night. But something inside Walter's life had shifted permanently. The trailer no longer sat forgotten beneath the trees. Fresh smoke curled daily from the repaired chimney. New insulation lined the walls. Firewood stacks rose neatly beside the porch beneath heavy canvas tarps. Somebody from town always seemed to stop by carrying soup, batteries, coffee, or simply conversation. Loneliness no longer lived there alone. Ethan found himself returning almost every afternoon after work without really planning to. Some days he helped repair old fencing buried beneath snowdrifts. Other days he simply sat with Walter on the porch drinking coffee while Ranger rested between them beneath thick wool blankets. Neither man spoke much during those quiet hours. They did not need to. The mountains themselves seemed to understand silence. One pale December morning, Ethan arrived carrying a small artificial Christmas tree strapped awkwardly into the back of his truck. Walter looked genuinely alarmed the moment he saw it. Absolutely not. Ethan smirked while untying the ropes. Too late. Ranger barked once excitedly as though fully supporting the operation. Walter shook his head slowly from the porch chair. Mary always handled Christmas. His voice softened beneath the cold morning air. After she passed, I stopped decorating. Ethan carried the tree carefully through the front door anyway. Then this year we start again. Walter watched silently while Ethan and Ranger somehow transformed the tiny trailer living room over the next hour into something warm enough to hold memory without pain. Leonard's wife dropped off old ornaments packed carefully in newspaper. Frank delivered tangled strands of colored lights while complaining loudly about modern extension cords. Harold arrived carrying homemade cinnamon rolls and immediately claimed he deserved military honors for surviving Leonard's driving. By noon, the trailer glowed softly beneath blinking Christmas lights while fresh pine candles filled the air with the scent of winter forests and old traditions. Walter stood near the doorway staring quietly at the finished tree. Small glass ornaments reflected softly in his tired eyes. One ornament shaped like a tiny angel hung near the top beside faded military dog tags Ethan had carefully wrapped around a branch. Walter slowly reached out and touched one of the ornaments with trembling fingers. Mary used to sing while decorating, he whispered. Ethan glanced toward him. What kind of songs? A faint smile touched the old man's face. Always old church hymns. Never knew the words correctly. Frank laughed from the kitchen. Nobody cared. She made pie. The room filled with low, warm laughter again, while Ranger stretched comfortably beneath the tree lights, tail brushing softly against the rug. For the first time in many years, Walter laughed too. Not the tired, forced kind people use to survive conversations. A real laugh. Rough with age, but alive. Ethan noticed something else changing as the days passed. Walter had started opening curtains each morning now. Started shaving regularly again. He even began wearing his old Navy jacket outside, instead of hiding inside the trailer whenever neighbors visited. Grief still lived in him. It probably always would. But it no longer ruled the entire house. One afternoon, while heavy snow drifted lazily beyond the windows, Walter sat at the kitchen table cleaning his Purple Heart carefully with a soft cloth. Ranger rested beside his chair while Ethan repaired a cabinet hinge near the sink. "You know," Walter said quietly, "I almost sold this thing for bread." Ethan glanced over. "Yeah." Walter turned the metal slowly beneath the kitchen light. "Funny how shame works." He paused briefly. "I thought hunger made me weak." Ranger lifted his head at the sound of Walter's voice. The old Navy SEAL slowly scratched behind the shepherd's ears while staring at the metal resting in his palm. Turns out asking for help was the harder battle. Ethan leaned back against the counter thoughtfully. "Most soldiers never learn how." Walter nodded once. "Because surviving trains you to carry weight, not share it." Silence settled gently between them while snow tapped softly against the windows. Then Ranger suddenly stood and trotted toward the front door. His ears lifted sharply. Ethan smiled faintly. "Guess we have company again." Moments later came the sound of another truck outside. Walter looked toward the window in confusion as a dark green pickup rolled carefully through the snow toward the trailer. A younger woman stepped out wearing a thick winter coat with a little boy bundled beside her in blue mittens and a knit cap nearly covering his eyes. Walter frowned slightly as they approached the porch. "Do you know them?" Ethan asked quietly. Walter shook his head. The knock came softly against the door. Walter opened it carefully while Ranger stood politely beside him. The woman looked nervous immediately. "Mr. Hayes?" Walter nodded once. The woman swallowed hard before speaking. "My name is Rebecca Reed." Walter froze completely. The world seemed to narrow into silence around him. Snow drifted quietly across the yard while the little boy beside her held a small toy truck against his chest. Rebecca's eyes already looked glassy with emotion. "Tommy Reed was my father." Walter gripped the doorframe tighter without realizing it. The little boy peeked shyly around his mother toward Ranger, while Ethan quietly stepped back to give them space. Rebecca reached carefully into her coat pocket and removed an old folded photograph. "My grandmother passed last spring," she whispered. "While going through her things, we found your letters." Walter's breathing became uneven. Rebecca handed him the photograph with trembling fingers. It showed two young soldiers standing beside a military dog near floodwaters beneath a jungle sky. Tommy smiling wide despite the mud covering his face. Walter beside him looking barely older than a boy himself. Duke sitting proudly between them both. Rebecca wiped her eyes quickly. "My grandmother prayed for 50 years that one day she could thank you in person." Walter stared down at the photograph while tears slowly gathered in his tired eyes again. The little boy stepped shyly toward Ranger and whispered, "Your dog looks like the one in the picture." Ranger gently lowered his head toward the child's mittened hand. Walter finally looked up at Rebecca. Through the quiet snowfall, his voice cracked softly beneath the weight of decades. "Your father was one of the bravest men I ever knew." Snow fell softly outside the trailer, while the small living room sat wrapped in quiet emotion too deep for anyone to interrupt. Rebecca Reed remained near the doorway with glistening eyes while her little boy knelt carefully beside Ranger, tiny mittened hands buried gently in the shepherd's thick sable fur. The dog stayed perfectly calm beneath the child's touch, amber eyes lifting occasionally toward Walter as though making sure the old man was still holding together. Walter stood motionless near the Christmas tree lights, the old photograph trembling faintly between his fingers. Tommy Reed smiling beside him beneath a jungle sky. Young forever. Untouched by age. Untouched by time. Ethan watched the old Navy SEAL carefully from across the room. Walter looked overwhelmed in a way grief alone never caused. This was something else. Recognition. The sudden terrifying realization that memory had survived beyond him. Rebecca finally stepped closer. "My grandmother talked about you all the time," she whispered softly. "She said Tommy trusted you more than anyone." Walter swallowed hard before speaking. "Your father saved lives that night." His voice carried the rough weight of memory. "Children mostly." Rebecca nodded slowly. Grandma said he died doing exactly what he believed in. The old man lowered his eyes briefly. He was brave. The little boy beside Ranger looked up curiously. Were you soldiers together? Walter stared at the child for a moment before kneeling carefully despite the stiffness in his knees. Ranger immediately shifted closer to steady himself against Walter's side like instinct. The old Navy SEAL smiled gently at the boy. We were. The child pointed toward the old photograph. And the dog too? Walter's face softened deeply. Yeah. He carefully touched Duke's image in the photograph with one weathered finger. Best partner I ever had. The boy studied Ranger thoughtfully before whispering. He looks like he still protects people. Ethan quietly lowered his eyes at that. Walter glanced toward Ranger resting calmly beneath the Christmas lights and gave the faintest nod. Some dogs never stop. Rebecca slowly reached into her purse and removed another folded envelope. There is something else. Walter looked up uncertainly. My grandmother wanted you to have this if we ever found you. She carefully handed him the envelope. The paper looked old but preserved. Walter opened it slowly beneath the warm glow of the Christmas lights while snow drifted beyond the windows. Inside rested a faded newspaper clipping dated October 1972. The headline read, Local Navy Team Saves Village Children During Flood Evacuation. Beneath it was a photograph Walter had never seen before. Himself carrying a little girl through floodwaters while Duke walked beside them. Tommy stood behind them, smiling despite exhaustion. Walter stared at the image silently, while emotion tightened visibly across his face. Rebecca spoke softly. That little girl was my grandmother. The room fell completely still. Ethan looked toward the photograph again in quiet disbelief. Walter's lips parted slightly as though words themselves had abandoned him. Rebecca wiped a tear from her cheek. You saved her life before she even had my father. Walter's hands trembled harder now. I do not remember, Rebecca smiled sadly. She remembered enough for both of you. Ranger slowly pressed against Walter's side once more, grounding him gently beneath the weight of decades colliding together in one room. The old Navy SEAL looked around the trailer slowly. Christmas lights glowing softly. Coffee warming the air. Friends in the kitchen pretending not to eavesdrop, while clearly crying into their mugs. A Marine standing quietly beside the doorway. A little boy laughing softly while Ranger nudged his mitten. The old man's eyes filled again. All these years, he whispered. I thought everybody was gone. Ethan stepped closer beside him. Not gone, he answered quietly. Just waiting to find you again. Outside, evening began settling over the valley in pale shades of blue and silver. Snow coated the pine branches heavily while smoke drifted upward from the trailer chimney into the cold Montana sky. Inside, Rebecca eventually helped her son into his winter coat while preparing to leave before the roads iced over again. The little boy hugged Ranger tightly around the neck before stepping toward Walter shyly. Mama says Grandpa Tommy would have liked you. Walter's face crumpled softly beneath the weight of that sentence. He carefully rested one trembling hand against the child's shoulder. Your grandfather was a better man than me. The little boy frowned thoughtfully. Mama says good people always say that. Frank muttered quietly from the kitchen. Smart kid. Rebecca embraced Walter gently before leaving. Thank you, she whispered. Walter looked confused. For what? Tears shined in her eyes again. For bringing part of my family home. After they left, silence settled softly through the trailer once more. But now it felt full instead of empty, alive instead of abandoned. Walter sat slowly beside the Christmas tree holding the photograph and newspaper clipping in his lap while Ranger curled against his boots. Ethan lowered himself into the chair across from him. Neither man spoke for a while. Finally, Walter looked toward the Marine with tired eyes shining softly beneath the lights. You know something strange? Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. Walter glanced down at the purple heart resting on the table nearby. A week ago, I was ready to sell every piece of my past just to survive another winter. Snow tapped quietly against the windows while the Christmas lights reflected gently in Ranger's calm amber eyes. Walter slowly folded the newspaper clipping and placed it carefully beside Tommy's letter near the old metal box. Now he paused softly. Now it feels like God spent 90 years returning everything I thought I lost. Ethan looked toward the old Navy SEAL for a long moment before answering quietly. Sometimes grace takes the long road. Walter smiled faintly at that. Then he reached down and rested one weathered hand against Ranger's thick fur while the shepherd leaned peacefully into the touch. Outside, the valley disappeared beneath winter darkness. But inside the little trailer tucked among the pines, warmth glowed steady against the cold like a prayer finally answered. Christmas morning arrived beneath a sky so clear it looked carved from glass. Snow blanketed the valley in untouched white light, while the mountains beyond Kalispell stood silent and ancient beneath the pale winter sun. Frost shimmered across the pine branches surrounding Walter's trailer, turning the entire hillside into something almost holy. Inside, warmth glowed softly through the windows long before sunrise. The smell of coffee, cinnamon rolls, and wood smoke drifted through the small trailer, while old gospel music played quietly from a radio near the kitchen sink. Ranger lay stretched beside the stove, ears twitching occasionally at the sound of voices moving around the house. Walter stood alone near the front window wearing his old navy jacket freshly pressed for the first time in years. The Purple Heart rested carefully pinned over his chest. Beneath the warm kitchen light, the metal no longer looked like something ready to be traded away. It looked like memory reclaimed. Walter adjusted the collar slowly before glancing toward Mary's photograph near the Christmas tree. "You would have liked this one, sweetheart," he whispered softly. The Christmas lights reflected gently in the glass frame while snow drifted lazily outside. A knock sounded at the front door moments later, followed by familiar laughter on the porch. Ethan stepped inside carrying a cardboard tray of coffees while cold air rushed briefly through the trailer. Ranger immediately stood and crossed the room, tail sweeping happily against the floorboards. Ethan knelt automatically to scratch behind the shepherd's ears. "Merry Christmas, buddy." Walter smiled faintly. "Pretty sure he likes you more than me now." Ethan handed him a steaming coffee cup. Impossible. More vehicles slowly arrived through the morning. Frank and Leonard carrying wrapped presents they pretended were not presents. Harold balancing 2 pecan pies while loudly blaming slippery roads for nearly dropping them twice. Rebecca arrived later with her little boy bundled in a red scarf, carrying framed copies of the old newspaper clipping and military photograph she had restored professionally. By noon, the tiny trailer overflowed with people, laughter, winter coats, and the warm, crowded chaos of lives reconnecting after years apart. Nobody spoke much about the grocery store anymore. Nobody mentioned medals for sale or loneliness or unpaid bills. Those things still existed somewhere beneath the surface of life, but they no longer defined the old Navy SEAL sitting at the center of the room beneath blinking Christmas lights and surrounded by people who now refused to let him disappear quietly. Ethan stood near the kitchen doorway watching Walter carefully throughout the afternoon. The old man looked different now, still 90 years old, still carrying grief in the tired lines around his eyes, but lighter somehow, as if something heavy had finally loosened its grip after decades of silence. At one point, Rebecca's little boy climbed onto Walter's lap, holding a toy military truck, while Ranger rested nearby with his head across the child's boots. "Mama says Grandpa Tommy was your best friend," the boy said quietly. Walter looked toward the old photograph hanging near the tree. "One of them." The child studied the Purple Heart pinned to Walter's jacket. "Were you scared in the war?" The room softened into silence around the question. Walter looked down at the little boy for a long moment before answering honestly. "Every day." The child blinked in surprise. "Even heroes?" Walter smiled gently. "Especially heroes." Ethan lowered his eyes at that while the soft glow of Christmas lights reflected against the trailer windows. Outside, snow continued falling in slow, peaceful waves across the valley. Later that evening, after dinner dishes had been cleared and most visitors slowly returned home through the snowy roads, quiet finally settled over the trailer once more. The Christmas tree glowed softly in the corner beside Mary's photograph and the restored military pictures Rebecca had framed. Frank and the others had left only an hour earlier after too much pie and too many arguments about football nobody actually cared about. Now only Walter, Ethan, and Ranger remained awake. The old Navy SEAL sat beside the stove wrapped in a wool blanket while Ranger rested faithfully. At his feet, Ethan stood near the window watching snow drift through the darkness beyond the porch light. "You know," Walter said softly, "I used to think getting old meant becoming invisible." Ethan glanced toward him. Walter scratched slowly behind Ranger's ears while the shepherd leaned peacefully into the touch. "People stop asking questions. Stop visiting. Stop seeing you. The fire crackled quietly between them. But maybe, Walter paused thoughtfully. Maybe loneliness just makes us forget we are still worth finding. Ethan looked toward the old man for a long moment before answering. You were never lost, Walter. Snow tapped gently against the windows. Ranger lifted his head and rested it against Walter's knee once more. The old man smiled softly down at him. Funny thing is, his tired eyes drifted toward the purple heart resting over his chest. I almost traded away the last proof I mattered. Ethan shook his head quietly. No, he glanced toward the photographs hanging beside the Christmas tree. Tommy Reed smiling beneath a jungle sky. Duke standing proudly beside young soldiers. Rebecca's son asleep on the couch, still holding the toy truck. You just forgot that medals were never the proof. Silence settled gently through the warm little trailer tucked deep among the Montana pines. Walter looked slowly around the room one final time. The repaired walls. The glowing Christmas lights. The smell of coffee and pine. The Marine standing quietly near the window. The loyal German shepherd who somehow arrived exactly when Grace decided to return. Tears gathered softly in the old man's eyes again, but this time they carried no shame, only gratitude. Walter rested one weathered hand against Ranger's head, while the shepherd closed his eyes peacefully beneath the touch. Outside, the valley disappeared beneath fresh snow and winter darkness. But inside that once-forgotten trailer, warmth remained steady against the cold like a small miracle refusing to go out. And somewhere beyond the mountains, beyond memory, beyond all the years grief had stolen from him, it finally felt possible that Mary, Tommy, Duke, and every soul he once mourned alone could see him. Now, and know one simple truth. He had not been abandoned after all.